Hello, and welcome to This Week Explained, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the American media landscape to help you understand the complexities of our ever-changing world. I'm Tiana, and each week, my co-host Kervin and I break down the biggest global events and what they mean for you. This week, we've got a packed episode. We're diving into the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, Iran's nuclear ambitions, and China's construction of a massive military compound that's raising eyebrows around the world. We'll kick things off with two major developments in Ukraine. First, we'll unpack Donald Trump's controversial comments about leveraging Ukraine's rare earth minerals in exchange for U.S. military aid. Then, we'll explore the details of his proposed peace plan, which is set to be unveiled at the Munich Security Conference next week. There is a lot to cover, so let's jump right into the rare earth minerals conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tiana, for that. This week, President Trump did suggest that the billions of dollars in U.S. military aid to Ukraine should be secured, but with a caveat. He says that there should be access to Ukraine's vast reserves of rare earth and critical minerals. And this idea, honestly, isn't even entirely new because it was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky who had previously proposed a similar arrangement because he wanted to appeal to Trump's deal-maker instincts.
Why are these minerals so important, and why is Ukraine such a key player in this market?
Well, as you know, they're essential for all of our modern technologies. They're used in electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, but they're also used in advanced military hardware. And Ukraine holds about 5% of the world's supply. It makes it a significant player on the world stage. Now, the problem here is that many of these resources are located in the eastern portion of Ukraine. And so they're at risk of falling under Russian control. Now, why is this all important to the United States? Well, securing access to these minerals is going to reduce U.S. reliance on China, which currently dominates the global rare earth market. So China controls up to 90% of the production of these rare earth minerals, and it's partly through its Belt and Road Initiative. And that's secured mining rights in all of those third world or resource-rich countries.
Okay, so how is Zelensky responding to these comments by President Trump? I mean, obviously, Trump taking credit for something that Zelensky already proposed.
Yeah, that's the Trump framework, right? Trump's always got a bold plan, and then we find out, well, that was already something. We did that with the border conversation, right? Plans that he had put in place were actually talked about during the Bush administration and the Clinton administration. And look, back to the Zelensky question, he's being very strategic on this, and he's framed Ukraine as an asset rather than a liability. He's offering a strategic partnership to give the U.S. access to its mineral wealth, and that was all part of his victory plan that he put out last September. Zelensky's also emphasized the need to secure these resources to prevent them from being seized and utilized by the Russian Federation.
So what are the potential risks and benefits of this proposal?
Well, here's the thing. This really could be a win-win situation. So the U.S. would get access to critical minerals. That's going to boost its position in the global tech race, or all around the world, globally, like I said. And at the same time, Ukraine would then lock in continued U.S. support and investment. But I don't want to ignore the risks here. Trump's approach, true to his style, seems to be a piecemeal plan at best. There's also real concern that he's going to push for a ceasefire that ends up favoring Russia. And if Ukraine's mineral wealth gets used as a bargaining chip, it could seriously complicate the country's future sovereignty and security.
Since you brought up the ceasefire talks, let's get into Trump's proposed peace plan, which is set to be unveiled next week at the Munich Security Conference. So what do we know so far?
Well, the details are still emerging, but the news outlet Bloomberg has reported that the plan includes freezing the war along the current front lines. Then it calls for withdrawing Russian forces from occupied Ukrainian territories, and then providing Ukraine with security guarantees that would prevent future Russian aggression. Now, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, that's former General Keith Kellogg, he did confirm that he will present the plan at the conference, and that runs from February 14th to the 16th. And he has described this plan as, quote, solid, unquote, those are his words, and he hinted that it aims to achieve what he calls peace through strength.
Okay, so can you break down what peace through strength actually means?
Yeah, sure. Peace through strength is actually a phrase that's been used in foreign policy for decades now. What it essentially says is that it is using military and economic power as leverage to bring adversaries to the negotiating table. So in this case, it seems to suggest that the U.S. would use its influence, whether through military aid, sanctions, or diplomatic pressure, to push both Russia and Ukraine toward a compromise.
So when Kellogg says both sides will need to compromise, what does that actually look like?
I mean, based on what Kellogg hinted at, it sounds like Ukraine might be asked to soften its stance on reclaiming all of its occupied territories, particularly Crimea. That's going to be a no-go for Russia. And it's been a sticking point since 2014. On the other hand, Russia's going to need to pull back its forces from areas it occupied since the 2022 invasion. And the idea is to find middle ground that stops the fighting. But as we both know, that's easier said than done.
Right, but doesn't that kind of compromise risk undermining Ukraine's sovereignty? I mean, wouldn't giving up territory set a dangerous precedent?
Yeah, and it's a valid concern. It's one that we've both had since this war kicked off. And it's also one of the biggest criticisms of this kind of approach by the Trump administration. So if Ukraine is pressured to give up land, it could send a message not just to Putin, but to other aggressor nations that invading a neighbor can actually pay off in the long run. Now, the main concern here is China's aggressive actions toward Taiwan. That said, this is also going to leave Ukraine vulnerable to future aggression if the security guarantees aren't ironclad. So while the plan might stop the immediate fighting, it could create long-term challenges for Ukraine's sovereignty and their security.
And what about Russia? Wouldn't a ceasefire along the current front line essentially reward them for their aggression?
Yeah, and that's the big issue. Freezing the conflict where things stand now would leave Russia in control of significant parts of eastern Ukraine. And the interesting thing is that this whole plan reads as if it only rewards Russia. As we know, Ukraine's counteroffensive has taken over parts of the Kursk region in Russia, but that area doesn't seem to be included in the plan. I will say, all of this is speculation, as the full plan hasn't even been released yet, so I will refrain from commenting any further until we see the actual entirety of the plan.
Okay, so while we wait for the plan to officially be released, what should we be watching for in the coming weeks?
Well, first, as always, keep a close eye on Russian propaganda. So the Kremlin's going to likely frame this deal in a way that benefits its own narrative, so it's really important to analyze how Moscow spins the proposal and what that reveals about their own intentions. Then watch Zelensky's public statements versus his private actions. So while he's going to express openness to negotiations publicly, his behind-the-scenes move will be key to understanding whether he's seriously considering any concessions or simply using diplomacy to buy time. Now, finally, like I said, the deal itself needs to be scrutinized in its entirety. Any loopholes or vague language could be exploited by Russia post-war, especially if the territories are left what I would call in limbo. Now, the devil is always in the details, and ensuring Ukraine's sovereignty and security must remain the top priority.
Now, shifting gears to a highly controversial proposal from President Donald Trump regarding Gaza, which blew my mind whenever I saw the press conference between him and Benjamin Netanyahu. So, Kervin, this one is making waves, as it should be. President Trump's plan has ignited outrage both at home and abroad. So please break it down for our listeners. What exactly is he proposing?
Yeah, and I want to be very clear about this because it seems like the media, as well as people on social media, have forgotten something that you and I have been calling Trumperbole. During his presidency from 2016 to 2020, we actually saw this repeatedly. Trump would throw out an idea, or he's going to make an off-the-cuff remark, and it would spark emotional reactions across the board. Now, the thing is, he's not a traditional politician, and that's both what people love and hate about the guy. He's unpolished, and unlike past presidents, he doesn't filter his words or guard his messaging. So what we're seeing in public from Trump are often the kinds of conversations that usually happen behind closed doors, so we never even hear about them. So when Trump suggests resettling displaced Palestinians outside Gaza or talks about the U.S. taking ownership of Gaza to redevelop, which has everybody up in arms, it's important to recognize that this is a plan and it's not necessarily the plan.
All right, but you're saying this could be just one of the plans, which explains why emotions are running high, not just among those who oppose President Trump, but even within his own base. I mean, after all, he promised to end wars, not start new ones. This proposal, though, feels like it could spark conflict. So what's the reasoning here? Is there a strategic angle to this, or is this simply Trump being Trump?
Yeah, look, there's definitely a strategic angle, but it is layered and nuanced. So saying this publicly actually puts pressure on regional allies like Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia to align more closely with the U.S. and Israel. Now, by presenting such what I would call an extreme plan, I think Trump is likely trying to force these nations to coalesce around a more moderate solution, particularly as Iran ramps up its nuclear program, which we'll get into later, and deepens its influence in Gaza through its proxy Hamas. Now, on the other hand, this does actually align with Trump's previous administration's approach to Gaza. He's likely viewing this as an economic opportunity, a chance to transform Gaza into a redevelopment project that's tied to the Trump brand. Now, he may not want to be like previous presidents and make his money on the speaking circuits and do it like he always has, developing new properties.
So it's part geopolitical strategy and part business ambition to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. But this plan has already faced significant backlash. I mean, right?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And it's not surprising. Everything that man says garners an immediate emotional reaction. And honestly, the international response has been overwhelmingly negative. Egypt and Jordan, that already host large Palestinian populations, they outright rejected the idea of resettling Gazans within their own borders. They warned that such a move would destabilize the region. Now, Saudi Arabia, which has been negotiating a potential normalization deal with Israel, reaffirmed its commitment to a Palestinian state and criticized the plan as a threat to regional stability. Look, even Hamas has condemned the proposal. That's unsurprising. But they did come out public. They called it a recipe for chaos. And let's not forget Iran. They're trying to exploit this situation to strengthen their anti-U.S. narrative, rally support among Palestinians, and then escalate their backing of Hamas and other proxy groups in the region.
Well, it sounds like this plan could backfire internationally. But what about domestically? How is this playing out in the U.S.?
Well, domestically, it's a political minefield. Trump's victory in 2024 leaned heavily on moderates and libertarians who were drawn to his promise to end forever wars. Now, while Trump insists there won't be a long-term U.S. military presence in Gaza, we got to be realistic about this. This kind of plan almost certainly requires some form of U.S. involvement on the ground. If that's not through direct military deployment, then likely it'll be through government contracts, hiring private security personnel. Those are still U.S. people. Now, from what I've seen in libertarian circles, they view this as yet another unnecessary foreign entanglement. And if U.S. troops or even private U.S. contractors end up in Gaza for a project that, by Trump's own admission, is going to take 10 to 15 years, it risks alienating these key voter blocs.
That's a huge risk for President Trump, especially considering how much of his appeal has been tied to his America First platform. If this plan is seen as dragging the U.S. into another prolonged foreign commitment, it could undermine his credibility with the very voters who helped him win in 2024. But let's dig into this a little further. How exactly does this create a political vulnerability? Are we talking about a loss of support from his base, or could this also impact broader Republican support in Congress? And what about the optics internationally? Could this plan backfire on multiple fronts?
Look, first of all, if U.S. troops are deployed to Gaza, that's going to open the door for Democrats to capitalize politically. They're going to frame that as another broken promise from another politician, and that's actually going to resonate with moderates and independents who supported Trump, because of his commitment to end these forever wars. So we've seen this playbook before. If we think back, I know it's a long time ago, but think back to the backlash against the Iraq War. That helped Democrats regain control of Congress in 2006. A prolonged U.S. presence in Gaza could give them a similar narrative. It's one that paints Republicans as dragging the country into another costly and unnecessary foreign entanglement, which Trump used very well in this election cycle. That kind of messaging is going to reverse Republican gains in both the House and the Senate, especially heading into the 2026 midterms.
So this plan not only risks destabilizing the Middle East, but it could also have serious political consequences for Trump and the GOP. What is the broader
the broader risk is that this plan could undermine U.S. credibility and influence on multiple fronts. Forcing Palestinians out of Gaza is going to be seen as a violation of their sovereignty. That's going to damage America's reputation as what they would call themselves as a mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This could push regional allies further away and then open the door for rivals like China and Russia to expand their influence in the Middle East. And at the same time, Iran's likely going to use this as a pretext to escalate its own activities. That's going to further destabilize the region. That's not going to do what Trump says he wants to do. And then let's not forget the logistical and legal challenges of taking what is being said as ownership, quote-unquote ownership, of Gaza. Trump hasn't provided any details on how the U.S. would justify or enforce such a move, so there's a lot that we still don't know.
I don't think we or enforce such a move, especially if he wants Trump Towers lining the beaches there and everything.
Yeah, and I think everybody who's concerned should be concerned. It's legitimate to concern. Some of the things that I've been reading that give me caution is there were a lot of, what are called, and this isn't a diss on anybody. I know MAGA used to just be a diss for people who would support Trump forever, but now they've taken that word and that's who they are. Forever Trumpers are MAGA. And so the MAGA accounts were very much opposed when Trump initially said this. And the next day, it was very curious to me that every single one of those accounts began to post these exact words. I have had time to sleep, and I have a different reaction to what Trump said. Mm-hmm. And they all said, I have had time to sleep on this, and I have a different reaction to what Trump says, which is something that we talk about all the time. Your emotional response in the beginning isn't really what's going on. It's just your emotional response to it. But it looks like the narrative is being pushed out to these accounts from the Trump administration.
So you think he's requiring them to change?
I think they're being told. This is just what I think. And it could be tinfoil hat put on your conspiracy theorist hat.
Okay.
But I think word came from somewhere in the Trump administration PR department to stop calling this a bad plan and start saying that, quote, I've had time to sleep on this and I have a different opinion now.
So now they support it?
Now they support it.
Okay.
Or they say they support it.
That's bizarre.
But that's not going to resonate with libertarians, I can tell you, especially. But we're both in the libertarian crowd, and we've talked to people who are libertarians. They do not like this, and they're not going to be bought and paid to change their mind on that.
My main thing is it's just for the benefit of one family, it seems like.
The Trump family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he wants to stamp his name on everything that's built there, which is wild to think you can just lay to a disputed area and then use it for your benefit and openly talk about it. And we'd
probably talk about this for hours, huh? Just back and forth on how I think it's not a great plan.
You don't have a right to that land. No one has a right to that land except for the Palestinians. So,
well, the Israelis would argue they were there first.
Right.
If we look historically, so how far back do we go historically? Mm-hmm. And you and I typically say we have the lines in modern history that the Palestinians were there from a certain time. Mm-hmm. The Israelis or the Jewish population that was brutally murdered and forced out of Germany, needed a new home. They were put in certain places, and they fought wars to draw those lines. Those lines have been drawn for decades now, and it is my opinion that those lines remain, and the people who live there now or have lived there before this tragedy happened get to go back to their location and rebuild it on their terms.
Yeah. I would agree with that. But also, it's just, I don't know how there are people who are supporting this. I don't understand.
Listen, I don't think anybody really supports this, but a lot of these social media accounts are predicated on supporting one side or another, and that's how they make
They
their
don't want
money.
to cross the party line.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I mean, to me, it sounds like the risks far outweigh the potential benefits. But, okay, let's play devil's advocate here for a moment, okay? Could this plan work in any capacity or alternative timeline or other universe?
And that is such a fair question, because we can say we don't like it, but that doesn't mean it can't work. I will say in this instance, I don't think this plan would work. And, I always talk about getting outside your echo chambers and not having confirmation bias. I do sometimes, because I go and see what Mike Baker is saying about it, because I think we see the world in the same way, correctly, I would say.
That's bias right there.
Very much bias. And I think everybody appreciates when you call me out for my own biases. But he said, he was on a Fox News program, and he said, from a real world perspective, this is never going to fly. It's not going to happen. Forcing Gazans into Egypt or Jordan does not solve the problem. It just shifts it, and it risks destabilizing the region even further. And we're not even talking about rebuilding Gaza. That's going to be a long and arduous process. If that mirrors Iraq's reconstruction after the invasion in 2003, where they had no bid contracts and those companies used exploitative local labor, that's going to fuel a lot of resentment and extremism that's not going to bring stability. Then we'll talk about putting U.S. forces there. If they are needed as peacekeepers, I can tell you, U.S. military, we're not good at peacekeeping. We're good at doing very few things and doing them very well. Peacekeeping is not one of them. That's a recipe for disaster. It puts troops at risk, and it gives Hamas the space to regroup and continue its campaign of terror. Without addressing the root causes of all of this, as we keep saying, this plan creates more problems than it solves.
So, in your view, this is more of a political gamble than a viable strategy.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And Trump may be using this proposal as a way to pressure regional allies and then also isolate Iran. But look, the risks, both domestically and internationally, are significant. They could help the Democrats take control of the Senate and the House. So without careful management, this plan's going to backfire, and it's going to create more problems than it solves.
Well, I mean, it's certainly a bold move, but as you've laid out, it's fraught with challenges. We'll have to keep a close eye on how this develops, especially as the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas remains fragile. Up next, we're shifting our focus to Iran's nuclear ambitions. But before we dive in, we need to take a quick break for a message from our sponsors. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, listeners. As we hinted earlier, we are going to get into Iran's nuclear ambitions. So, Carvin, let's start with the basics here. What's the latest on Iran's nuclear program?
Well, Sienna, recent American intelligence reports have revealed that a covert team of Iranian scientists are exploring ways to rapidly develop a nuclear weapon. Now, the key here is that they're looking for a shortcut. That's something that's going to allow them to convert their uranium stockpiles into a weapon within months rather than what we believed would be years for them to do that. And if their leadership does decide to go down that path, that is very scary.
Well, as if 2025 couldn't get any more complicated, now you're telling us that we're hearing reports that Iran may be ramping up its efforts to develop a nuclear weapon. So Has Iran officially decided to move forward with finalizing the creation of a nuclear weapon?
So it doesn't look like they have yet. The intelligence that we've seen indicates that while Iran is preparing for the possibility, no decision has been made to race toward a bomb. But the fact that they're even exploring this option is a major concern for the United States, for Israel, and honestly, for everyone else in the Middle East.
So what's driving this urgency on Iran's part?
Look, Iran's become isolated since Hamas took that bold move to go into Israel in October 2023. Since then, all of Iranian proxy forces have suffered major setbacks. Then they started doing missile strikes on Israel. That didn't achieve any significant results. Tehran is likely looking for a way to deter potential strikes from Israel and also, quite honestly, the United States. And a nuclear weapon, or even the credible threat of one, would be a powerful deterrent.
Okay, so let's talk about uranium enrichment. How close is Iran to having weapons-grade material?
Oh boy. Obviously there's a lot of other people who are much more educated on this than me, but from what I can tell and from people I've spoken to, Iran is currently enriching uranium at 60% purity. That's just 30% shy of the 90% needed for weapons-grade material. Now, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, Iran has about 200 kilograms of uranium enriched to that 60% purity. And for context, they only need 42 kilograms of uranium, if enriched to that 90%, to produce one nuclear bomb.
That is a substantial stockpile, and it does raise a lot of questions. So, what is Iran's official stance on this buildup? Are they claiming it's for peaceful purposes, as they've done in the past, or are there signs that they're shifting their narrative? And how is the international community responding to their position?
Well, look, Iran maintains that its nuclear program is entirely peaceful. They insist it has the right to enrich uranium to any level it chooses, like any other sovereign nation. But U.S. intelligence and the IAEA have consistently reported that Iran had an organized military nuclear program up until 2003. That's since continued developing capabilities that go well beyond the civilian needs for nuclear energy. And this disconnect between Iran's claims and the evidence is a major point of concern for the international community.
And the elephant in the room is, what is Israel's response to all of this?
The Israeli elephant. Yeah, Israel has consistently argued that Iran never truly abandoned its nuclear weapons program. They view this as an existential threat, and their rhetoric and actions reflect that.
All right, so let's shift gears to U.S. policy. President Donald Trump recently reinstated his, quote, maximum pressure, end quote, campaign on Iran. So what exactly does that entail?
Look, Trump's approach is all about economic and diplomatic pressure. He signed recently a presidential memorandum reimposing strict sanctions on Iran with the goal of driving its oil exports to zero. Now, this was a hallmark of his first term, and he's bringing it back to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
Well, can you remind our audience, especially those from outside the U.S. who may not have followed Trump's first presidency closely, how effective was this strategy during his first term?
Love the guy or hate him, this was quite effective in crippling Iran's economy. And at one point, Iran's oil exports were driven to near zero. That is an incredible damage to their economy. Then the Biden administration came along, and Iran started to evade sanctions, and its oil exports rebounded. Now, in 2023, for example, Iran earned $53 billion from oil exports alone.
Okay, well, can you explain what's different this time?
Well, there's not a lot that's different. It's just that Trump's doubling down on it. He's directed the Treasury and State Department to enforce the sanctions more aggressively. That includes the 2024 Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum, the SHIP law, which I think was a chat GPT. Can you come up with something that says SHIP in the acronym? But I digress there. So this law targets foreign ports and refineries that process Iranian oil in violation of those sanctions.
And another major player in this geopolitical puzzle is China. So how do they fit into this situation, and what role are they playing in shaping the dynamics around Iran's nuclear ambitions?
You're absolutely right. China is definitely a key player in all of this. So they don't recognize the U.S. sanctions, and they remain Iran's largest oil buyer. In fact, they've created a trading system that bypasses the U.S. dollar, uses the Chinese yuan, also uses middlemen to work around those sanctions. Essentially, they're backing Iran's nuclear ambitions, but they're doing it in the way that China always does, vague statements and gray zone tactics. Now, with all that said, there are some signs that Trump's renewed pressure might be having an effect. One example of this is China started recognizing certain sanctions on maritime vessels, even going so far as to block some of those from docking in their ports.
And so what's Iran's response to all of this?
Look, Iran has warned that any attack on its nuclear sites is going to lead to all-out war in the region. Its UN ambassador has also called the snapback of sanctions, and I want to quote him personally, it's, quote, unlawful and counterproductive, end quote.
That's a strong warning. So how likely is a military confrontation?
Well, some analysts have it as possible. I'm still leaning toward unlikely for now. Israel has been very clear that it will not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, and the U.S. has traditionally backed Israel on this. I don't see that changing with the Trump administration. With all that said, though, a military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities is going to come with massive consequences. I think in this case, a diplomatic approach is more likely. We're probably going to see Trump apply more pressure to force Iran's hand rather than just escalating this to military confrontation.
Thank you for that analysis. Now, I want to shift to our final topic, which is the construction of a massive military command center in Beijing, reportedly 10 times the size of the Pentagon. And it's being referred to as Beijing Military City, and it's already raising serious concerns in the West. So, Kervin, what can you tell us about this facility? What do we know so far?
Look, this facility is being built by China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, and it's on a 1,500-acre site about 30 kilometers southwest of Beijing. So satellite images that I've seen show a massive construction effort. There's about 100 cranes working across a 5-square-kilometer area, and the project reportedly began in mid-2024. And while it's still in the early stages, it's already being described as the world's largest military command center.
That's incredible. And it's not just the size that's impressive, it's the purpose, right? What is the goal of this facility?
Well, yeah, the purpose is the main concern. I think many experts believe this command center is going to serve multiple purposes. It's expected to include heavily fortified underground bunkers to protect top CCP leaders, not the people of China. I just want to keep reiterating that.
Yeah, it's for the big dogs.
Yeah, and that's not just a communist thing or the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah,
every
government.
Yeah, but I mean, do you want me to tell you about the Pentagon and what's beneath the Pentagon? These same bunkers we're talking about right here.
Right.
It's for the top brass of the military to go under the bunkers and be protected. And I know a few people who were there in 9/11 when the plane crashed into the Pentagon.
Right.
When the two planes crashed in to the Twin Towers in New York, that immediately set off alerts in the Pentagon. Those major military leaders were sent underground to the Pentagon bunkers. When it crashed into the Pentagon, chaos ensued. When those leaders came back up, they had to do command and control and try to fix the situation. But they were protected, not the analysts sitting at their desk in their cubicle, forced to continue working. Right. So it all happens globally. And I keep on reiterating that. And I know Tiana appreciates that it's not just, I'm not harping on one government here. It's just, that's what's happening right now. It's got the underground bunkers. And that's to protect, honestly, from a nuclear war. The other thing with this is it acts as a control hub for coordinating military operations. It's essentially designed to ensure the survival of China's leadership and then maintain command and control capabilities during a conflict.
I mean, it sounds like a major strategic move, but China hasn't exactly been open about this project, have they?
No, not at all. And I wouldn't expect them to be. They've gone through great lengths to keep the construction discreet. You just
How
can't.
do you keep a military compound that large discreet?
Well, so there's no visible military presence around the site. So there is military presence, but we can't see it. You can just identify it. So it takes great imagery analysts like myself. No, just kidding.
He's not kidding.
To identify, certain pieces, especially with the PLA, where civilian pieces are used as military equipment. So you identify, is this a dual use piece of equipment? And if so, then that means the PLA is there doing something. That's how we know the military is working on it. Now, that's one way they can kind of keep the satellite images from identifying that this is a military project, but also access to the site is heavily restricted. You have security guards that are blocking the entry. Tourists are prohibited from visiting nearby areas. And there are signs that actually ban drone flights and photography from that area. So if you are in the United States and you've ever gone to a military installation, it's the same things you're going to see trying to get onto a military installation. Now, one interesting thing is that Financial Times reporters, who they're very friendly to CCP propaganda, they were even turned away and not allowed to have access.
Okay, so what's the reaction been from Western intelligence agencies?
Look, we're all concerned, I can tell you that, from every single person in my network still working in different Western intelligence agencies. Deeply concerned. This is not one of those things where I talk to somebody and they go, yeah, but look, it's not that big of an issue. No, it's a big issue. And that's because the sheer scale of this project shows that China is preparing for large-scale combat operations, what we call in the U.S. military LSCO, large-scale combat operations. It's what we're working on day in and day out in my job. Now, it's a clear sign, in my opinion, that China is preparing for that potential invasion of Taiwan.
It's interesting that this is happening as the U.S. is also stepping up its own preparations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because President Trump just announced plans for a next-generation Iron Dome. I'll leave that. I'll maybe touch on that some other time, and all of the problems that an Iron Dome missile system could have within the United States. But look, it shows that he wants to protect the mainland from various adversaries using hypersonic and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, both China and the U.S. are clearly preparing for worst-case scenarios, and that's why this development is so significant.
Just the mainland, so not like territories like Puerto Rico?
You're listening from Hawaii, I am sorry. You are the closest U.S. state. Now, Guam is the closest U.S. territory to all of this, and it will be utilized in a conflict. So we're going to see Guam being preparations and ramped up military operations. But Hawaii, I am sorry.
Well, okay, let's shift gears a bit. There's been some debate about the risks of concentrating so much power in one facility. What are the criticisms?
Yeah, look, it's a great point. And some commentators argue that putting all of China's top leaders in a single location during wartime could be a strategic mistake. A facility of this size would likely become a high priority target for enemy attacks. They're also going to have to utilize a ton of defense resources to protect from those attacks. And others suggest that CCP leaders might disperse to multiple locations once the war kicks off. And that's going to be better at protecting them by utilizing geographic things like the mountains, but also closer to where their defense missile systems are.
Okay, well, before we wrap up, Kervin, what's your take on the long-term implications of this massive military project in Beijing?
Look, it's a clear signal that China's not just preparing for the possibility of large-scale combat operations. It is actively positioning itself for those operations. This kind of investment in military infrastructure shows that Beijing is serious about its ambitions. Let me be clear. My assessment shifted in 2023. At that point, I assessed that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan by 2027 is no longer just a possibility. It is now a probability. That's only 2 years away from right now. And this timeline aligns with China's rapid military buildup, but it also aligns with Xi Jinping's stated goals for reunification.
I'm not going to let you get away with bold assessments without asking for further clarification. So
Never do.
What makes you so certain about this timeline?
Look, the signs are all there. China's military spending skyrocketed. They're not just building defensive capabilities. They're preparing for offensive operations. We talked about the mobile barges a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, whenever you're really in equipment in a military capacity, they're like dual use.
Dual use equipment, absolutely. And these roll on, roll off barges. That was the first. Well, that was the second thing. The first thing was a Gen 6 fighter jet. Possible.
Yeah,
Unlikely. No, possible. Generation 6 fighter jet. So the way that China, you know how close hold they are on the information that they allow to be released. The fact that they're allowing some of this stuff to come out in the public shows
a measure of confidence.
That, guys, we are prepared. And it's not just to show the rest of the world, it's to show their own people that what they would say, if an aggressive United States tries to come after China, you guys are protected because we take national security very seriously, and we have these protective measures in place, and we're not going to back down. So we've got the Gen 6 fighter, we've got these mobile barges, and now we have a new command center that's reportedly 10 times the size of the Pentagon. Tiana, you've seen the Pentagon. It's huge.
Right.
This is 10 times bigger. This is just another data point in all of this. You don't build these things unless you're planning for a major conflict. Now, add to that the increased frequency of Chinese military drills near Taiwan, the ramped-up rhetoric from Beijing, and then Xi Jinping's repeated statements that reunification with Taiwan cannot be delayed. All this points to a narrowing window for action, and 2027, or, God forbid, 2026, is shaping up to be a critical year globally.
We haven't gotten through 2025 yet, though.
I think that might scare me the most.
Yeah.
The sheer speed at which things are happening in 2025. And it's something that Donald Trump said, I told you guys we were going to go about this quickly.
Yeah.
We can't get our heads wrapped around it.
No.
I think that's part of a tactic, too.
It's got to be.
Because, microwave nation, right? It happens now, a minute later. Oh, we're on to the next thing.
But I'm tired.
Squirrel.
Yeah, squirrel.
I am very tired.
Very tired.
And having to comment on all of these things and prepare for this podcast like we do makes us even more tired.
And that's not even including the personal things we have going on right now.
Yeah.
So we have.
I don't even get into that.
No, we can't get into that. But yeah. So all kinds of things. Anyways, okay. So obviously that is a sobering thought. The possibility of a conflict in 2027, much less 2026. I don't want to even go there. But could this buildup maybe be more about deterring the U.S. and its allies, or are you just going to stick to this being a precursor to actual conflict?
Look, it could be both. On one hand, you've got China. They want to project strength and deter the United States and its allies from actually intervening. That's the ultimate goal. China here wants to win the war without firing a single shot. But the level of preparation we're seeing suggests that they're willing to act if they believe the conditions are right. The danger here is that deterrence often fails. Look, the Biden administration, I've been open and honest about this. They failed miserably in this endeavor. Okay. That was their whole thing. Deterrence through strength, right? We were going to build up our military, put it right on the front lines of Taiwan, and that's going to deter China. that did the exact opposite.
Right.
Some would argue if once this thing kicks off, the U.S. is at fault for being so aggressive to try to defend Taiwan. And I think that plays all into China's game here.
Yeah.
So that's really what they would want. Deterrence by building up all this strength. I think it's going to fail. But if Beijing does calculate that the U.S. will not respond decisively, or that maybe Taiwan's defenses are so vulnerable it won't matter, they could decide to move forward even quicker than what we're talking about. And let's not even forget, the longer they wait, the more time Taiwan and its allies have to strengthen their defenses. So they will not wait. That's why I believe 2027 is such a critical window for China.
Well, Xi Jinping did so.
He did. He continues to say that. And so listen to the man when he talks. Like we said with Putin, follow his actions. He's going to say one thing, and he's going to do something else. And you put those together, and you'll probably find the truth somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Well, obviously, that whole scenario is concerning. One that really forces us to think about how the U.S. and its allies should navigate this challenge. So,
no, that's all I can get into for right now. Do you have anything you want to talk about?
No.
Good. I'm just kidding. No, we love doing this. I'm not trying to rush you off to do something else, Tiana.
I literally have, I just don't really know what to say, I mean, I think I've blabbed enough today. So, thank you so much for listening to this tiny little independent geopolitical podcast. We hope you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please let us know. And if you want in-depth coverage of these stories and more, follow us on Instagram.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.
This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.